All right. Welcome, folks. Today, I'm going to be doing a lecture for Norco College class. This is the normally I would be giving a regular world history lecture for my regular world kids right now, but I'm using this time to do a lecture for Norco College instead for the U.S. history class. So just that you're aware, if you're one of my regular high school kids or a Euro kid, this is going to be all American history right now. For those of you that are tuning in for Norco College, today's lecture is going to be talking a little bit more about the age of reform, talking about utopian communities that started to develop during the early part of the 1800s. A lot of them related in part to the second Great Awakening and the notion of perfectionism. And we'll be talking a little bit about educational reforms, women's rights, things like that. And then also we will get into some things about prison reform. We're also going to be taking a look at manifest destiny. So this should be a nice solid lecture before next week's lecture, where we start getting into how to write a proper essay and talking about the rise of Lincoln and the new Republicans. So let's hop straight into it. I actually do now have PowerPoint on my computer here at home, so finally I'll be able to use that as we move through. Let me pop over to my desktop here, and I'm going to put this into slideshow mode. Play from start. Okie dokie. So, an age of reform. Finishing up talking about reform. Utopian communities. Various reformers of this time started to set up these kind of utopian socialist style communities. Now, when we talk about socialism in the modern context, it's a little bit different than how the utopian socialists worked. They live in a very cooperative, communitarian style. The utopian socialists are called so because they came from the era of Romanticism, which is in the early 19th century. So, from about 1800 to about 1848, this period of time in both American and European history is characterized by the Romantic art movement. It's also characterized by very romantic, overly idealized notions of the perfectibility of society at that time. And these utopian communities are established in places, particularly in the Northeast, in like upstate New York and stuff like that, but in other places too. I think there's some in Indiana, there's some in Ohio. But these utopian communities start popping up, and these reformers had this idea that if you could control the rules of a particular society, and everybody was of a like mind about the communitarian nature of it, that you could create this this kind of perfect society that no longer was based in the materialistic, rapidly industrializing society that they saw forming after the Industrial Revolution began at the turn of the 19th century. So many believed in this notion of perfectionism, which is a truly American trait, right? Think about in the preamble, the Constitution, to form a more perfect union. The idea that society could be made more perfect through a stronger spiritual connection or even fear of God. And that's why so many of these utopian socialist communities are also highly connected to the Second Great Awakening, which, of course, we learned about things like the Burned Over District and stuff like that. So one of the most famous stories of one of these utopian socialist communities is in 1825 in New Harmony, which was led by, actually, he was originally from England. His name was Robert Owen. And Robert Owen came over from Great Britain and established this communitarian society. And Robert Owen is one of, I would say, about 3 or 4 big names in along with some other utopian socialists of the time. Charles Fourier is another. A third would be Duc de Saint-Simon. All of these guys are kind of these utopian socialists who have a particular communitarian spirit that seemingly kind of both embraces the idea of industrialization, but also rejects the notion of the ruthless, cutthroat industrial capitalism that we saw forming in other places in the world at this time. So these guys are saying, like, look, industrialization's okay as long as everybody in the community shares according to need. There isn't, a whole group of people who are exploited for their labor, paid really bad, have terrible living and working conditions. It's really a reaction against all of that stuff. These guys are trying to create these perfect little communities, but as you know, there really is no such thing as a perfect community, and no matter how hard you're trying to create one, in some sense, what these communities do, for in the early days of New Harmony, for example, things go really well, but New Harmony collapses really quickly because word starts to spread that they have this kind of communitarian perfectionist style economy there, where people have a reasonable standard of living, the air is cleaner, there's this sort of egalitarian society that's been formed. And it attracts other people. And the types of people that it starts to attract may not quite have the same level of perfectionist spirit that, say, Robert Owen himself had. And so these more kind of shady, duplicitous figures start to become attracted to the community, and very quickly the community finds itself going belly up due to the fact that there's these exploitative folks that are attracted to it, and crime starts being a problem, and these people were not so perfectionist spirited as were Robert Owen and his followers. So they founded the first American kindergarten, free public schooling, free public library, again a very communitarian type spirit that gets spoiled by these kind of other folks that get attracted to that community. Brook Farm in Massachusetts was founded by a group of transcendentalists. The transcendentalist movement, characterized by like Ralph Waldo Emerson and folks like that, was usually very reactionary against industrialization. They were very, very suspicious, like Henry David Thoreau and people wrote these transcendentalist pieces that criticized the nature of industrial society and the effect that it was having on the human spirit. And so anyhow, this Brook Farm was formed by a group of transcendentalists and lasted between 1841 and 46. As you can see, also very short-lived. Formed a cooperative community with members working the common lands and devoting time to spiritual matters. And Nathaniel Hawthorne, who's yet another transcendentalist writer, also lived there at various times. The Oneida Colony was founded in New York, not far from the burned-over district. And this was founded in 1848. They have a tendency to be viewed as more radical. They believed that the second coming of Christ had already taken place, and they sought a new form of perfectionism based on a new morality. So they practiced some pretty radical ideas for the mid-1800s: free love, birth control, eugenic selection of parents to produce superior offspring. These are some pretty radical ideas at the time, and of course, again, this is all this kind of reactionary spirit to the Second Great Awakening that's going on at this time. Now, this colony flourished for over 30 years, largely due to its production of superior steel traps and the manufacturing of silver plates. So they actually were producing things that had some degree of consumer demand, and that allowed them to last a little bit longer. Another of these utopian socialist communities that gets established near the burned-over district was in Lebanon, New York, and they were known as the Shakers. These were the most communistic of all of them. They didn't believe that the second coming had already happened, but they did believe that Christ's return or the second coming was imminent. And so they were the longest lived of these utopian socialist sects, beginning in 1774, but they last over a full century, all the way up until about 1940, where the Shaker community is then kind of goes extinct. Set up about 20 religious communities. There were 6,000 members in the year 1840. They believed in sexual equality, and opposition to both marriage and free love eventually led to their extinction. Okay, public education reforms. Horace Mann's probably the best known of the American educational reformers of the 19th century. I think that there's still a Horace Mann organization today. So public education. Reformers saw public education as a way to instill Protestant morality and Republican virtue in children. And when you think about the role of public schools, even in modern times, public schools are really useful for indoctrinating in youngsters a sense of nationalism, but also you want, if you're increasing suffrage in society and more people have the right to vote, public education starts to become one of those taxpayer things that people are willing to pay for, because the government wants people to be able to make smart decisions at the voting booths. So an educated population starts to become a very pragmatic topic of this time, and this is where we see in the 19th century public schooling. And of course, public schools are going to be more available in urban areas than rural areas, because in rural areas it's hard to get the funding to support a school where people are going to have to travel for miles and miles and miles to be able to attend it. So public education finds itself proliferating faster in areas that have concentrated populations. But Horace Mann's one of the first important educational reformers of the age. He argued that a key to reform in the United States society was giving these kids better education, and he established what they used to call them state normal schools, to better train teachers in Massachusetts. And these days, of course, we still have similar types of systems in place. They're not called normal schools anymore, but essentially they're, in order to become a teacher of any sort, you have to go to college and have a degree in whatever you're about to teach, but also you need to have a teaching credential to make sure that you know how to teach. So his influence spread to other states, and impressive movements were made prior to the Civil War in advancing public education. Now you have to remember that in this time, it was, nowadays, pretty much if you have a pulse, you can make it to your college graduation. Your high school graduation. All right, it doesn't take. But back in the olden days, a lot of folks, it was very common not to make it to high school graduation, and so graduation rates these days are very, very, very high. And the expectation is you're in school until you're roughly about 18 years old, and then you graduate, and then you either can go on and do different things or go to college or whatever you want to do at that point. But in the olden days, the expectation that you graduated from high school and went to, primary and then secondary school all the way through your public schooling years was not very high, particularly in rural areas, and it was even lower for women. So if a woman was to be able to get her high school diploma, even all the way up until the 1940s, 1950s, this was considered a pretty big accomplishment. So keep in mind that although that these public schools are being created, and that we're seeing impressive improvements in the offering of education to folks, the expectation that they went the full distance with their entire public education was not very high. You see tax-supported public education triumph roughly between the years of 1820 and 1850 in much of the East and the Old Northwest, meaning like Indiana, Ohio, Illinois. Less so in the South, again, in part because it's much more agrarian, but also remember, it was illegal to teach slaves how to read. Slaves weren't even considered citizens. And so there was less of a need for the total population of the South, which included slaves, to have formal public education institutions. Laborers in working men's movements in eastern cities increasingly demanded education for their children, though, because if you're a laborer and you're going to work all day, you're leaving your kids alone. They could be quite young. 5, 6 is when you start kindergarten. And so the idea that you just leave a 5 or 6 year old on their own could get them in trouble. It could, result in them being taken advantage of or, whatever. And so they wanted a place where they could send their kids to be watched over rather than have them start working in factories at the age of 6 or 7 years old. You also see increased manhood suffrage meant that workers were pushing for free education for their children, and then wealthy citizens gradually supported free public education as they saw education as a means to promote order and moral reform among the lower class, meaning that you could indoctrinate these kids to act a particular way. Also, of course, like I mentioned earlier, things like nationalism and so on are promoted in public schools to get people to kind of forget about other barriers that may actually prevent them from relating as much to the elites, the social elites in society. If you can, all unite under a common Pledge of Allegiance, or you can all unite under a flag or whatever it is, it helps to smooth over some of these social grievances of haves versus have-nots. Now, despite some gains, some resistance to compulsory education also remains. So, you have working class families that needed their children to go to work. Some folks wanted their kids to get a job because it meant that they would bring in more income for the family. Secondary education, remember, this lags behind elementary education. Typically, if a kid made it to about 4th or 5th grade, that was pretty good. So as I said earlier, the expectation wasn't necessarily that you would just go from kindergarten all the way through your senior year of high school. Slaves, as I said earlier, were also forbidden to learn reading or writing. Also, keep in mind that even in the North, free black folks even were excluded from public schools. So there are definitely other factors that go into inclusion in terms of access to education. And then the bulging Catholic population, largely due to the Irish migration of the 1830s, resisted the Protestant moralizing of public schools and opted for Catholic parochial schools instead. Noah Webster was the first to publish an American English dictionary, and he was the one who helped to standardize the American version of English. His readers and grammar books were used by millions of school children in the 19th century, and it was largely designed to promote morality and patriotism. So if you've ever wondered why, Americans use the letter Z a lot more frequently, like if you were to say socializing in British English, a lot of words like that end with an S-I-N-G rather than a Z-I-N-G. Or if the reason that we spell color without a U, or other things like that, it's all thanks to Noah Webster, who made this dictionary to help, in fact, separate American English from British English and promote patriotism. Then you start to see other grade school readers. The McGuffey reader is a very well-known one, but there are other ones too. Holt is another big one. His grade school readers were William McGuffey's grade school readers were first published in 1830s. They sold 120 million copies between 1836 and 1960. And the lessons, of course, again, emphasizing morality, patriotism, idealism, as well as punctuality, sobriety, frugality. So these are all ideas of perfectionism that are rooted right in the schoolwork curriculum to bring kids up of a particular social understanding. So it's a powerful thing. The education system, when you think of it in this context, is a powerful thing to be able to mold society like a piece of clay into what the visionaries of these movements wanted to have happen. So you have higher education. The Second Great Awakening led to this creation of denominational liberal arts colleges, mostly in the South and in the West. Women's schools gained some respectability in the 1820s. For example, Emma Willard established in 1821 the Troy Female Seminary in New York. Oberlin College opened to both men and women in 1837, as well as for African Americans. And then you had these lyceums, which provided venues for traveling lecturers in science, literature, moral philosophy, to come in and give speeches to folks who may or may not even be going to the local college institution. But these lyceums were opportunities for people to go and listen to somebody who was knowledgeable of a particular subject area and learn something from them. So you had 3,000 lyceum lecture associations that existed by 1835. In contrast to morally oriented public schools, lyceums were more about encouraging independent thinking, encouraging new ideas, questioning authority, as opposed to listening to authority and being obedient to those qualities of society that were being purposefully indoctrinated or instilled into youngsters. So women's rights and origins of feminism. Let's talk about some reforms in women's rights. Gender lines start to be more sharply drawn in the 19th century due to the Industrial Revolution. So this market revolution really did start to separate men and women into distinct economic roles over time. Now, when the Industrial Revolution first began, as we talked about, you had, for example, these factories that were specifically designed for housing and providing work for women. And so we talked about like the Lowell Mill Girls, for example, in Lowell, Massachusetts. But as time goes on, it becomes less and less and less likely that women are going to go and take a risk in working in factories. And it starts to become kind of those old patriarchal beliefs about women, hoots with the devil and stuff like that, and that the liminal barrier between women and sin was much narrower than between man and sin or whatever. And so, like these sorts of notions are very, very strongly rooted in religion, and due to the changes that we're seeing happen in society in the 19th century, you see some reactionary practices, I guess, gender practices pertaining to women's role in society when women start going and working in factories and actually, being successful and starting to earn money. There's a reactionary force against that says, oh, a woman's proper place is in the home. If you let women work, who knows what could happen, and that kind of thing. And so, and to remember this idea of Republican motherhood, where Abigail Adams, going all the way back to the, founding the Constitution, had asked her husband, John Adams, to remember the ladies. And what happens? They basically get forgotten. So the role of women was this whole Republican motherhood. They were supposed to, keep society's conscience. I told you that story about how a lot of times, even today in modern day times, the expectation that women teach you to chew with your mouth closed, or mom teaches you to take your feet off the table, or take your shoes off when you come in the house, or whatever it is, that a lot of the moral responsibility of societal conscience is the responsibility that rests on women a lot of times. And that men kind of have a tendency to act a little bit more brutish or whatever. But again, these reforms that we're seeing with women in society having a special responsibility to raise kids to become productive, loyal citizens, start to take a much more defined role in the 19th century, where women were expected to stay in the home, to raise the kids, and to do those sorts of things, and that it was a man's job to go and get a job or work or bring home the money to the family or what have you. And in the household as well as outside of the household, I think it's quite clear that there was this very strong trend towards patriarchy, where women's rights were curtailed in favor of this notion that men should be the head of household and men should be the head of government, and so on and so forth. So this cult of domesticity came to dominate particularly the middle class, and to a smaller extent working class. Of course, the poorer off that you are, the more necessity there is for women to work. But the women, if you were a proper woman in society, quote unquote, that meant that, your husband made enough money where you were able to not work, and then your role was then to raise kids or whatever else. And again, the revivalism of the Second Great Awakening reinforces these traditional views of women because, as I said, this is very much rooted in religion, patriarchy. Religion itself is very patriarchal. And, if you think about the Father, the Son, and so on and so forth, these sorts of notions make it so that women play the role of the angel in the home, if you will, guardians of morality and raising kids to be proper citizens. Now, some women, of course, are seeking to break away from that role of homemaker. And so, particularly as the century goes on, the 19th century moves on, you start to see middle-class women engaging in activism, like suffragette movement in Britain and stuff like that. And so, and then, too, even before that, in the Enlightenment period, you had a number of notable women, Mary Wollstonecraft, Marie-Therese Geoffrin, and other folks like that, who wanted to advocate for women to be able to participate in the intellectual movement of the Enlightenment. And while their efforts may not have been recognized in their own time, certainly today we look back on those efforts to say that women ought to have been able to participate and gain an education in the same capacity as men and have every ability to do so. Female reformers advocated women's suffrage and other rights for women. They also participated in the general reform movements of the age, particularly temperance and abolitionism. Remember that because women's responsibility in society, the gender roles were expected for women to, in particular, have this moral compass that perhaps they keep society on track. Republican motherhood, angel in the home, cult of domesticity, all of that sort of stuff culminates in women basically using some of these perfectionist reformist issues to demonstrate their capability in society. And so when we think about women and the role that they play in the American social reform movements of the 19th century, because women were advocating for temperance, because women were advocating for abolitionism and so on, education reform and this, that, the other, women were able to attach themselves to these honorable, perfectionistic qualities in society and give themselves legitimacy to say, look, we're the ones who have been advocating for cracking down on drinking, for example. So this lends a sense of responsibility to women that legitimizes the cause for suffrage later on down the line. Also, of course, World War I in the turn of the 20th century, 1914 to 1918, World War I is another just unignorable demonstration of the essential nature of women in society. When men go off and fight these wars, women take their jobs in factories, and it becomes completely obvious to anyone after World War I that women not only have earned but deserve the right to vote. And so these are major turning points. Okay, and then too, also even in the area of abolitionism, meaning like ending slavery. I showed you last week the PBS. I don't know if you guys watched it or not, but I put out that episode of the abolitionists, and the Grimke sisters were so important for the abolitionist cause in the North, even though they were from a southern plantation and owned slaves themselves growing up. They took this moral perfectionist approach and, again, legitimized the cause of abolitionism. Elizabeth Cady Stanton urged equality for women, legal rights to sue, the right to own property. Remember that there was this practice of femme covert, where a husband literally took control of his wife's property upon marriage. Going all the way back to the early 1600s, there was that other policy of coverture, where a woman's legal identity was, her individual legal identity was quote unquote covered by her husband when she got married. So she was literally no longer even considered a legal individual anymore. And we're seeing some major changes to these kinds of policies. Lucretia Mott, along with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, she helped to organize the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. Susan B. Anthony, who was a Quaker, was also a protege of Stanton and a militant lecturer for women's rights. And famously, Susan B. Anthony was put on the silver dollar. And then the Grimke sisters, as I mentioned a minute ago, and Angelina Grimke and Sarah Grimke, Southern abolitionists, women's rights advocates, powerful, powerful writers on behalf of the women's rights movements. Their role in the abolitionist movement created a bridge between that movement and the new women's rights movement that starts to be supported by other abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison. Lucy Stone helped to organize the first National Women's Rights Convention in 1850. She was also an avid abolitionist, just like the Grimke sisters. And after the war, she created a women's only suffrage organization and retained her maiden name after she was married, which was not a very common practice in those days. And so women who followed her example were known as Lucy Stoners because she kept her maiden name when she got married. Amelia Bloomer popularized the short skirt with Turkish trousers. We're also seeing trends in fashion change. Bloomers were challenged as too masculine and immoral. And Margaret Fuller edited a transcendentalist journal called The Dial. She wrote that women were the spiritual and artistic equal of men and should be recognized as such. And that's where we get to finally the Seneca Falls Convention, which was July 19th and 20th of 1848. Big year in history, 1848. Lots of major changes happening. So the Seneca Falls Convention is where they launched the first modern women's rights movement. It was organized by Elizabeth Stanton and Mott and attended by 61 women and 34 men. And the Declaration of Sentiments of the Seneca Falls Convention stated that all men and women are created equal. And so we're starting to see some societal changes or questioning of authority on the famous lines of the Declaration of Independence and so on that said that all men are created equal, but how about women? And of course, in the French Revolution, this had already been addressed with the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen because women were included in that. And they demand women's suffrage, and they sought property ownership for women within marriage and sought increased child custody rights for women. And the mainstream press and churches were, of course, very strongly opposed to this because those conservative forces are going to be threatened by the upset of kind of patriarchal order at that time. Now, the women's rights movement does end up being overshadowed by the movement of abolitionism in the Civil War, which increasingly we're seeing these problems boil over into the 1850s and into the start of the 1860s. So the Seneca Falls Convention starts to lose some of the traction that it had started to gain as a result of problems boiling over with sectionalism between the North and the South. Gains for women prior to the Civil War, though, included that women were gradually starting to be admitted to college, starting in Mississippi in 1839 and New York in the late 1840s. Women could actually own property after they married. And then after 1860, some states passed laws that enabled women to work or own a business independently. Now, that was one of the things that was really difficult, is for women to get a job in anything other than being a school teacher or a nurse was very, very, very difficult. But after 1860, we do see some states starting to pass laws that, at least on paper, make it so that women are able to work or own a business. Now, whether or not they're actually practicably able to do this is a whole other story, right? Just because you make a law about something doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to open up opportunities or allow for for the law to be followed as written. So these are probably things that, while the laws start getting passed, practicably we don't see the effects of these laws happen for a number of decades afterwards. Dorothea Dix worked to improve the treatment of the mentally handicapped at this time, so we're starting to see a new understanding of what mental illness is. Now, of course, a lot of the understandings of mental illness have really only come out of the last roughly 50 years or so. So I want to caution you not to think that like this is a super modern understanding, but it used to be just that, mentally ill folks were treated very, 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 very badly. And if a person had a severe mental illness, they were treated, really worse than an animal. They were thrown in chains and locked up in dungeons, basically, and were kept in these horrible, horrible conditions for no fault of anything other than the fact that they are ill. And so she ends up being one of the most successful reformers of the age, and reported on the horrible conditions in prisons, poorhousements, and these dungeon basements where basically insane folks were often kept in chains. And her efforts resulted in improved conditions and influenced the view that folks who are mentally ill were not willfully perverse, but they're sick. They have something going on that is outside of the realm of their control, and they're not doing it to be weird. They're not doing it to make other folks uncomfortable. They're doing it because they can't help it. And so this starting really in the latter half of the 19th century, we start to see some reform efforts to improve the conditions for folks who, have problems. So they would go to hospitals and asylums, which again, still by modern day standards are not probably appropriate, but they're improvements from just being thrown in a dark cellar. So there's an attempt to try to progress the treatment outcome. Also, prison reforms happening during this time where inmates were given increased access to religious services. It used to be basically the idea that if you were a prisoner, rehabilitation is not going to happen. Like, you're once a criminal, always a criminal, and the punishments for them were severe and very, very harsh. And so we're starting to see increasingly punishments for people who break the law shifting to rehabilitation rather than like simply punishing folks. And now there are constitutional provisions that prevent cruel or unusual punishment from being administered. But for a long time, going back to European history, before the Americas were even settled by the English colonists, punishments were really, really, really cruel, and also the administration of justice was very uneven. And so now with prisons, the idea is like maybe you could rehabilitate people, teach them some foundational skills, and then send them back out into the public where they don't screw up anymore and break laws and do dumb things. So there's groundbreaking institutions built in New York, Philadelphia, etc., that gain kind of world renown for their more humanitarian practices with how they start to deal with inmates. And then, two, they started to isolate inmates in cells because they realized that if you allow inmates to congregate with one another, it kind of ends up resulting in making them better criminals. So they didn't want convicts to be adversely influenced by other bad apples in the orchard. Prison officials served as moral advisors for prisoners, and prison reforms, generally speaking, they don't see the level of success that they otherwise could have due to the fact that there's a lot of overcrowding in prisons. It's difficult to get public funding for prisons because to convince the taxpayers to dedicate funding to people who are societal mess ups is a really hard sell. So generally speaking, that's why in modern day times, prisons are largely private. They're private institutions, and they're still overcrowded, and the degree to which people are rehabilitated is very, very, very low. There's a lot of recidivism where people get out of prison and it's just a revolving door. They go back out, they commit more crimes, they go back to prison, they get out, they commit more crimes, they go back to prison. And so they're in and out, in and out, in and out. So the practice for imprisoning people of debts, though, does get reduced significantly. So there's no longer debtor prisons. And in 1833, the federal government actually outlaws imprisonment for unpaid debts. Now, that's not to say you can't go to prison for other things, for not paying taxes and stuff like that. You can get still in some serious trouble for tax evasion, like Wesley Snipes was an actor. He got in some trouble for not paying taxes for a number of years. But again, that was like a deliberate thing. He was deliberately trying to con the government and so on. So you still can get in trouble for, tax evasion or misrepresenting things or fraud, stuff like that. But for just going into too much debt, you can't just be put in prison for going into too much debt. But there are other problems that accompany that. Okay, so changing families. We're seeing more women avoid marriage at this time. Up to 10% of women by 1860 chose not to get married. Women start working as school teachers and in domestic services. About 10% of women worked outside of the homes for pay in 1850, and then 20% had been employed at some time prior to marriage. Most women left their jobs, though, upon becoming married and started becoming homemakers, and again, that has to do with that cult of domesticity thing. Godey Ladies Book, which is a magazine founded in 1830 and survived all the way up until about the turn of the 20th century, promoted this cult of domesticity, and it was a very widely circulated magazine in the United States, particularly prior to the Civil War, reaching a staggering 150,000. And what's so interesting about this is the thing that's neat about magazines, and in a more modern time, television shows and news media and so on, is it informs people how to live. So the degree to which people live their own lives, quote unquote, is very, very, very heavily influenced by how they are informed by things like magazines, tabloids, in modern day times, advertisements, the internet, news media, and so on. And so there are instructions for how to live. And that's exactly what this ladies magazine did, was it demonstrated trends of what you're supposed to dress like, what you're supposed to act like, what you're supposed to say in certain situations, how a lady is supposed to be. So there are these societal expectations that are placed onto people to be able to mimic the behavior that they are told is quote unquote appropriate or proper for society. Catherine Beecher, major proponent of having female teachers in public education as a motherly instinct to raise kids to be, again, it's a product of that cult of domesticity. You want a mother in the classroom to raise kids in the proper way. A man in the classroom is going to get frustrated. He's going to get angry. He's going to get upset. He may start slapping the kids around or whatever. A woman has a gentler hand. She's expected to have this moral compass about her. She's expected to raise kids as though she's the mother of those kids, and it's going to be a warmer environment for raising children. And this is why Catherine Beecher in particular advocated for having female teachers in public schools. Moving forward. Okay, so most marriages were based on love rather than arrangement. And so we're seeing companionate marriage rather than just marriage based on economic contracts between families. So as a result of that, families become much more close-knit, much more affectionate with one another. They also grow smaller. There was an average of about 6 kids in a household in 1800, and there's less than 5 in 1900. And burrs fell by about half during the 19th century because people are having smaller families. That's also on account of the fact that in an industrial society, kids become a liability because kids are very expensive when area is limited. So the more kids that you have, the bigger place that you need. When you're living in an urban area, the larger place that you need there, the higher demand there is for space. And so those spaces become very, very, very expensive. So kids become kind of a liability. And so we're seeing right now a transition through that 18 to 1900 century into smaller families, urban living, and that kind of thing. On a rural, in a rural setting, you want more kids because they're help on the farm and stuff like that. And then, of course, we start to see the use of contraception as well, birth control. Smaller families meant child-centered families. It used to be the case when you raised kids in the 19th century. Kids were more or less treated as just small versions of adults. They were treated extremely harshly. And I'm sure that doesn't come as much of a surprise to you because of all the child labor issues that we talked about pertaining to the early days of the Industrial Revolution, where you had, literally kids under the age of 9 working in coal mines and stuff like that, or in factories, cotton factories, and kids are kids. They're going to show up. They're going to do dumb things. They're going to accidentally fall. They're going to trip. They're going to cut their hand off in the machine. It's just a total danger and a liability. So nowadays, after we see smaller families start to emerge, children are starting to be raised to be, independent and moral citizens. There's this whole idea of spare the rod, spoil the child, meaning like don't beat your kids, spare the rod. Spoil the child, raise them in a way that demonstrates to them that they're loved, that they're cared about, that they're individuals, that they have moral responsibilities to the rest of society, and so on. So the outlines of the modern family were very clear by the mid-1800s. And these are all upper middle class families here. But you can see kind of the family spirit change over time. All right. Manifest Destiny, the second part of today's lecture. So, if you remember anything about high school history, you might remember the term Manifest Destiny. Kind of a controversial topic. So, as the nation expanded, and we're seeing westward expansion in particular, regional tensions start to develop, especially over the issue of slavery. And this eventually culminates in the Civil War, the course and aftermath of which transformed American society entirely. So the theme of this next part here is that, they're emboldened. Americans at this time are emboldened with a spirit of manifest destiny in the United States. And they started to begin acquiring vast territories in the West in the 1840s. And the acquisition of Texas and half of the Oregon Territory is very shortly later followed by the Mexican War that yielded the United States what was known as the Mexican Cession Territory, and reignited the entire slavery issue at the same time, because the more states that start to be admitted into the Union, the more imbalance that we get between free states and slave states in Congress, and this is going to be immediately perceived as a threat by the South. The United States became more connected with the world as it pursued an expansionist foreign policy in the Western Hemisphere and emerged as the destination for many migrants from other countries as well at this time. And enthusiasm for United States territorial expansion, fueled by economic and national security interests and supported by claims of U.S. racial and cultural superiority, resulted in war, the opening of new markets, acquisition of new territory, and increased ideological conflicts as well. So this is going to open up a whole lot of, this whole manifest destiny thing is going to open up a whole new can of worms as we progress into the 1840s, 1850s, and then into the Civil War in the early 1860s. So the idea of manifest destiny, which asserted basically U.S. power in the Western Hemisphere and supported U.S. expansion westward, was built on this belief of white racial superiority and also a sense of American cultural superiority, and helped to shape the era's political debates as well. So we are seeing, those same kinds of notions of white, patriarchal, and racial superiority, promoting this Western expansionism of the time. So manifest destiny, the idea that basically Americans are continuing to move westward across the continental United States, settling in the western territories of now California, Oregon, and Washington, but also other places too, along the way in Colorado and so on. And it's kind of like, for a while there, they kind of jump over the center states because there are a bunch of rocky mountains there, I guess. And it's hard to start up farms in those regions. And so that's probably part of the reason that a lot of those regions don't get settled until actually after California. So California becomes a state in 1848, but Utah, Colorado, Wyoming, those territories come a little bit later, so people kind of actually end up going back east again a little bit. But anyway, I digress. The point of the story here being that, you have this kind of, in the same sense that Europe at this time is beginning to toy with the idea of imperialism, and in particular the new imperialism, where increasingly Europeans are going to start settling in areas that they hadn't before in Africa and Southeast Asia and so on, with the notion of white man's burden, the idea that it's white Europeans' responsibility to go to these other places and, like a father to a child, raise them in a proper light. Americans are very much doing the same thing. They have their own imperialist movement as they are moving westward across the United States, while at the same time removing Native Americans or outright slaughtering them, and establishing new states. And this ignites other problems on the American stage pertaining to slavery. So Manifest Destiny, millions of Americans in the 1840s and 50s believed that God had chosen Americans to control the entire Western Hemisphere. So they believed that their mission was to spread democratic institutions literally from sea to shining sea. And land greed and idealism, of course, joined into a potent mix for expansionism at this time. And Manifest Destiny was a phrase that was first coined in 1844 by John L. Sullivan. The idea that it's our duty, it is our destiny to go to these areas on the western coast and connect the two sides of the nation together, and for American culture to dominate the Western Hemisphere, and indeed much of North America. So the movement had really already begun under Jackson with the Trail of Tears, and Van Buren too, when they both removed Indians from the southeast regions over to what became eventually the state of Oklahoma, which was supposed to be Native American territory reserved for them. And you can see some art here, and again, they're facing to the left, meaning Manifest Destiny moving westward. That's all deliberate here. The Oregon Trail being another aspect of Manifest Destiny as well. So the election of 1844 was an expression of Manifest Destiny, as Texas is kind of the leading issue of that campaign. Now, we talked a bit about Texas last week, and I introduced Austin and Houston, Sam Houston to you. We talked about the Alamo. So the expansionist Democrats, particularly Southerners, supported James K. Polk in the election of 1844. And historians have often extended that idea of Jacksonian democracy, kind of populist-oriented democracy, government, by the people, popular government, all the way through James K. Polk's presidency. So from 1828 to 1848. And during this time, I don't know if you remember that I told you, Jackson didn't really want to touch the Texas issue and make Texas an annexed territory because he was concerned that it could weigh too heavily in the campaign, and he had already decided not to run for re-election. So to step aside from that issue, we see that Texas gets annexed. Is it going to become a state? Is it not going to become a state? And so he sought to annex Texas and gain Oregon all the way up to the 5440 parallel. Now, Whigs had nominated Henry Clay. This was his third run for president. Remember, he never becomes president, going all the way back to that corrupt bargain problem that he faced under John Quincy Adams. But Northern Whigs were opposed to the incorporation of Texas as a new slave state because it could encourage the spread of slavery beyond the western boundary of Texas. So Clay's attempt to straddle the Texas issue ended up actually costing him the presidency once again. And the Liberty Party ends up being the first party created for the anti-extension of slavery. And the candidate for the Liberty Party at that time was a guy named James Birney, who was the founder of the Kentucky Anti-Slavery Society. And the party actually ended up being a third-party candidate in both 1840 and 44, but really does not have a massive influence on the outcome of the election. So Polk defeats Henry Clay 170 to 105 in the Electoral College, and the Liberty Party took enough votes away from Clay that he lost the New York count by only about 5,000. But even with those 5,000 votes, it likely would not have ended up resulting in a different outcome in the election, only winning New York. But it is possible that it could have ended up costing him the election in the long run. So, because New York had 36 electoral votes. So, anyhow, this is kind of how the electoral map comes out for the Polk-Clay presidential electoral college count. And so Democrats now are claiming that they have a mandate for annexing Texas. And so Manifest Destiny, Tom, Texas, Oregon, Mexican cession. Texas in 1845, Oregon in 1846, and then the Mexican cession happens in 1848. And that's where we're going with next. So now Texas becomes a state. The Republic of Texas had lasted for 9 years. Mexico, of course, had refused to recognize Texas's independence since 1836. And they threatened war with the United States if the United States attempted to annex the territory of Texas. So, Texas feared Mexico's larger and superior military forces to their own, and was hoping that the United States would come in on their side. So they signed instead treaties with England, France, and the Netherlands for protection in 1839 and 40. Britain was interested in Texas as a buffer zone against further U.S. expansion because Britain doesn't want to see the United States take more territory and become a larger entity to deal with competitively. And then the area could be used as well to challenge the Monroe Doctrine. And France also hoped to divide North America. So in 1845, Tyler got a joint resolution through Congress for annexation of Texas, and really this only required a majority vote. He didn't push for a treaty because a treaty would have required a 2/3 vote in the Senate, and there were a lot of Whigs at the time who were opposed to Texas's entry into the Union as a slave state. So this joint resolution in Congress only required a simple majority, and Tyler interpreted the narrow election as a mandate for annexation of Texas. So Texas was basically already a part of the United States by the time that Polk took the oath of office in March of 1845. All right, so here's President John Tyler, and Mexico claimed that the U.S. had unjustly taken Texas because it's technically not their territory and refused to annex the fact that Texas had been annexed. And here's James K. Polk, 1845 to 1849. So, James K. Polk is only a one-term president, but he is considered one of the more successful one-term presidents in U.S. history because he basically gets done exactly what he said that he was going to get done. So he's a strong proponent of Jacksonian ideals. He's a strong Democrat. A lot of folks even called him Young Hickory because, remember, Jackson was known as Old Hickory. So he's a strong Jacksonian idealist. Polk was a slave owner his entire life. He owned plantations in both Tennessee and in Mississippi. And Polk's 4-point program was what he wanted to achieve in his presidency, and he achieves it in less than 4 years. So the first point of this program is known as the Walker Tariff of 1845, and this lowered the tariff of 1842 from 32% down to 25%. So again, decreasing that abominable tariff. Its passage coincided with Britain's repeal of the Corn Laws, which was a protective tariff in Britain to artificially raise the price of grain so that British grain growers would make more money from Brits buying domestic grain than from having to compete against cheaper foreign-grown grain. And so the passage of this Walker Tariff coincided with the repeal of the Corn Laws, which led to increased trade and increased government revenues. And so this was actually one of the lowest tariffs in recent U.S. history. The tariffs had reached well into the 30s and 40% at one point, and now it's coming down a bit. Also, another thing that he wanted to do was the restoration of the independent treasury system and the acquisition of California and the settlement of the Oregon dispute. So all 4 of these 4 points end up being achieved in less than 4 years. Let's talk a little bit more about Oregon. This region had been disputed for a long time in certain sections of Oregon by both Spain, Russia, Britain, and the United States. And John Jacob Astor was the one who developed the American Fur Company into a huge enterprise organizing the fur trade from the Great Lakes all the way over to Oregon. So when Astor died in 1848, he ended up actually being the richest man in America at that time. But Oregon is increasingly becoming connected. And Spain had given away claims to Oregon when America bought Florida in 1819. So their claims to Oregon went with the Florida Purchase Treaty of 1819. However, there was still conflict with Russia, who had made claims on those territories. Fort Ross actually had been established by Russia in 1812, just north of San Francisco in the Oregon Territory. The Monroe Doctrine was intended at that time by John Quincy Adams partly to reject those Russian claims on those territories. So Russia retreated all the way up to the 5440 line due to the 1824-25 treaties with the U.S. and Britain, where the U.S. and Britain became the sole possessors of the Oregon Territory. American migration flowed into the Oregon region, mostly south of the Columbia River, and the path that folks took was by way of the Oregon Trail, of course popularized by the famous video game of the 1980s. So in the 1840s, a flood of pioneers came to Oregon on a trail that had originally been blazed by Jedediah Smith. Now, this 2,000-mile trail was not an easy journey. There was an average of 17 deaths per mile on the Oregon Trail, which is, of course, a huge number. And on the Oregon Trail, which was not an easy game if you ever played it when you were a youngster, it was not that easy to get to Oregon. There were all sorts of things that could go wrong, between animal attacks or starvation or disease, or drowning, or whatever, you name it. There's all sorts of different crazy stuff that could happen along the trail. You were really roughing it to take the trail out that 2,000 miles. So the trail began at Independence, Missouri, or at Council Bluffs, Iowa, and ran all the way over across the Rocky Mountains to the western coast. By 1846, over 5,000 settlers lived south of the Columbia River, and Britain only had 700 people living north of the river. So we're starting to see increasing numbers of Americans outnumbering the numbers of Brits living in that particular region. You can see here the trail that folks took all the way across to Oregon. And Britain was concerned about large U.S. migration to that region, so a disputed area between the Columbia River and the 49th parallel existed. This is that disputed area, what is now modern-day Washington, south of the Canadian border. And so you can see here that these are the disputed regions north of the Columbia River that the British did not want to lose influence in. So this is the 49th parallel right here, which runs all the way along the U.S.-Canada border. And the United States signed the Oregon Treaty of 1946, where they received the Oregon Territory all the way south of that 49th parallel. Now, the war with Mexico influenced many senators to seek a quick end to the dispute. Northwestern states were angry that Southerners got all of Texas, but the U.S. did not get all of Oregon. And so this is where we see the Mexican War. In 1846 to 1848, Mexican War, the Mexican-American War, is often thought of as a forgotten war, but it is a rather important one, particularly for the state of California. So President James K. Polk sought to buy California from Mexico, which was owned by Mexico, just like Texas had been owned by Mexico at that time. But Mexico, of course, is going to say no to that because they're super mad about the whole Texas issue. So America basically took Texas, and they're like, hey, by the way, can we buy California? And Mexico's like, no, what are you, nuts? So California was seen as this major gateway to the Pacific. There had been gold mines found there in 1848. And Texas the Texas annexation caused Mexico to sever their diplomatic ties with the United States. Also, in Texas, there's a boundary dispute. See, the original southern boundary was supposed to be the northern Nueces River in Texas, but Texans said, no, the Rio Grande to the south is the actual boundary of where Texas is. So this boundary dispute of where the southern border of where the southern border of where Texas would be and where the start of Mexico would be is disputed depending on if you're Texan or if you're Mexican. So Polk honored the Rio Grande because he wants to see Texas be a very large state as the Texas southern boundary. Mexico was really not as concerned over the boundary as much as the fact that they just wanted all of Texas back. So the to them, they don't really care. To them, they see it like Texas isn't yours, so give it back to us. So this is what results in the Mexican-American War. Here you can see the Rio Grande River as the current southern border of Texas. This was supposed to be the original southern border, was the Nueces River right down here, but the Rio Grande ends up becoming the border because Mexico, spoiler alert, loses the Mexican-American War. Polk had sent an envoy to Mexico City, like a diplomat, in late 1845 to try to buy California for $25 million. But Mexico says, no, it's not for sale. By the way, give us Texas back. So feeling slighted, Polk now looked for a reason to go to war with Mexico. And so they declare war against Mexico in January of 1846 when Polk ordered future President General Zachary Taylor to march from the Nueces River down to the Rio Grande River and ordered the Navy in the Gulf of Mexico and the California coast to be ready to go to war. And Polk was basically prepared to force a showdown with Mexico, but none ended up occurring. So Zachary Taylor, during the Mexican-American War, really became America's biggest war hero, as now you saw, like, old William Henry Harrison had already died and stuff like that. So Zachary Taylor is able to make quite a name for himself in the 1840s and 50s. So here you can see Fort Brown, where the actual war with Mexico began, down here along the southern part of the Rio Grande River. By April, Mexican troops crossed the Rio Grande and attacked one of Taylor's surprise patrols, resulting in 16 casualties, and Polk sent his war message to Congress in response. Technically, Congress has the right to declare war. The president can't just go rogue and declare war on anyone. So May 13th, Congress overwhelmingly voted to support a declaration of war. There were only 14 Whigs in the North who voted no against the American declaration of war against Mexico. Conscience Whigs were known as they were known as Conscience Whigs. A majority of Whigs opposed the war in principle. Some Whigs had questioned if the war had begun on U.S. territory and if Polk had started the war under false pretenses and so on. This is where we see these spot resolutions come into place, where Representative Abraham Lincoln actually sought to expose the exact spot where the war began. And this is where, some of these more radical Whigs were trying to kind of call into question politically the motivations of Polk and his declaration of war. Really, a lot of Whigs in the North believed that the U.S. had no legal right to the land south of the Nueces River, all the way going down to the Rio Grande there. Well, Ralph Waldo Emerson, who I mentioned earlier as a transcendentalist writer, feared the slavery issue in the new conquered territories would lead to a severe sectional crisis. He said famously, "Mexico will poison us." Henry David Thoreau also opposed the war and wrote a few years after going to jail, for not paying his taxes to support the war, wrote this book, Civil Disobedience, about resisting paying taxes for wars that should be illegal. Southern expansionists, on the other hand, were watering at the mouth to take over more Mexican territory because they wanted to extend slavery into the regions of eastern Texas. Mexico had hoped that U.S. involvement with Britain over Oregon would erupt into a war that was destructive to the United States. However, it doesn't. They wanted to humiliate the United States for the whole Texas issue. So the U.S. conquered California and occupied parts of Mexico, including Mexico City, where General Santa Anna, who had been defeated by Texas in 1836, seized power again in 1846 and led Mexico's failed efforts to repel the U.S. invasion of Mexico, which results in Mexico City being completely occupied militarily by the American military. So this was a war that lasted about a year and a half. Mexico very quickly capitulated, and it's a significant war because, of course, it brings in not only Texas but also California into the American Union. So U.S. General Winfield Scott was the one in charge of occupying the Mexico City capital, and this is where the Mexicans were forced into signing what became known as the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. which was signed in February of 1848. And this is where the United States officially gained California and the entire Mexican Cession territory, which makes up the modern-day states of New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, and Nevada. So Mexico really lost basically half of its territory as a result of signing the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and losing the Mexican-American War. And the United States in this treaty agreed to pay $15 million and assumed the claims of the United States citizens against Mexico of about another $3.25 million for damages dating back to the Texas War of Independence. So here is the entire Mexican Cession territory. As you can see, it's difficult to even imagine that this entire region of California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico and even parts of western Colorado here could ever be considered anything but American lands. But lo and behold, they did not belong to America until about halfway through the 19th century. So this was approved by the Senate. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was approved by the U.S. Senate 38-14, despite a very bitter debate about it. And the Mexican Whigs disapproved of the war and even threatened to cut off supplies to U.S. forces in Mexico, while expansionists in the South clamored for all of Mexico, they wanted to continue taking more of Mexico's land. Calhoun, in fact, pushed for the treaty immediately before significant opposition mounted. And you can see the U.S. territorial gains from 1845 to 54 here. Texas gets annexed in 45. You had this entire unorganized territory that is still yet to really be settled. This is the Mexican Cession territory that they gained in 1848. Just a couple of years earlier, they had gained the Oregon Country territory from Britain, and then all of the Minnesota territory up here in 1849. And Minnesota becomes a state in 1858. So the United States in this manifest destiny period is adding a huge amount of land to the territory of the United States. So the results of the Mexican War, most significantly, of course, the slavery issue gets reignited by the Mexican War. Would slavery exist in some of these new territories that the U.S. had taken over from Mexico? So the Mexican War basically contributes to the Civil War in the long run, really. Abolitionists saw the Mexican War as a conspiracy of Southern slave owners to try to extend the institution further and further and further west from the Deep South. Now, of course, if you know anything about geography, the further west that you move from eastern Texas over here, the more and more and more dry the lands become and the more mountainous they become. So to be honest with you, slavery was only ever going to exist in this southern region in the southeast. It really could not exist effectively in the southwest as much, but that didn't matter as much at that time because they were very concerned that they would find a way to make it work for other materials there. So maybe slaves don't make cotton in the southwest, maybe instead slaves make cotton, or instead they mine, coal or something, whatever else is found in these regions here, which were largely still unexplored territories. So there's a considerable amount of concern that slavery could extend further west, and of course Northern Whigs don't want to see that happen. Now, the Wilmot Proviso is the last thing that we're going to talk about for today. This was of 1848. Now, this was a proposed law, but it does not get passed in Congress. So the Wilmot Proviso is something that I'm going to talk about, but you have to understand it's just a proposed law. It doesn't actually get passed into law. So what the Wilmot Proviso said was that it proposed that slavery should never exist in any of the territory that was gained from Mexico in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And it twice passed the House, but it could not get past the Senate. It was endorsed by all but one free state, and Southerners really resented Northern attempts to prevent the expansion of territories. So this Wilmot Proviso is it's kind of like taking a temperature when you have a fever. It's letting you know that there's a symptom. There's something going on here where we're seeing a sectional divide between the North and the South, specifically over the issue of expansion of slavery. Now, the U.S. territory increased by about 33%, including Texas, which was bigger than the Louisiana Territory that had been purchased from Napoleon by Thomas Jefferson in 1803. And 13,000 Americans died in the Mexican-American War, mostly due to disease. But these are just some of the outcomes of the war. This is, sentiment for expansion of not only slavery, but just in general of Americans taking over more and more and more lands of the West and settling on those lands to the extent that they are able eventually to become official states is also another major outcome of the Mexican-American War. And then finally, Latin America began to view the U.S. negatively as the Colossus of the North, where U.S. forces, who fought in the Mexican-American War, began to gain better experience, and this would affect the scope of the Civil War as well. So that brings us to the end of today's lecture. Thank you so much for tuning in today, and I will make sure that this link is available to you guys. I think I already made it available to you guys on Canvas, actually. So, if you want to go back and watch anything, you're more than welcome to, and have a great rest of the day. Thanks.